so much to get to that's important, but I want to start with this line. Quote, "I think spying did occur." That was recited by the Attorney General of the United States, the bombshell statement about spying on President Trump's 2016 campaign. He didn't say FBI surveillance. He said spying. He didn't say on individuals in the campaign. He said on the campaign. I think spying occurred on the campaign.
Let's put it all into context. This happened during day 2 of testimony, of course, by Attorney General Bill Barr in front of Congress. He defended his decision to launch a review of allegations, the Russia investigation, why it even existed from the start. Allegations that President Trump repeated today. Now, Senate Democrats also are trying to get to the bottom of exactly what will be redacted by the Attorney General in the version of the report Congress and the public is going to see. In another very heated exchange, I think it's fair to say that, Barr was pressed on the decision to absolve President Trump of obstruction of justice. Watch this.
The thing is, you put this out there. I mean, the president went out and tweeted the next day that he was exonerated. That wasn't based on anything in the Mueller report with respect to obstruction of justice. That was based on your assessment.
It was the conclusion of a number of people, including me, and I obviously am the Attorney General. It was also the conclusion of the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein.
I understand. No, I've read your letters, Mr.
And I will discuss that decision after the report.
Did Bob Mueller support your conclusion?
I don't know whether Bob Mueller supported my conclusion.
All right, let's bring in Ken Delaney. Sorry.
I've got a feeling there's not enough Sharpies in the world to cover the amount of content that is going to be redacted before it's submitted to Congress.
There's going to be 2 different versions of redactions now. Let's bring in Ken Delaney, an NBC News intelligence and national security reporter, and Liz Holtzman, former Democratic congresswoman who voted to impeach President Nixon. Ken, a lot of news coming out of that hearing. I got to imagine the biggest takeaway was this reference to spying in the campaign.
Yeah, that was really a remarkable moment, guys. You don't often hear U.S. law enforcement officials refer to lawfully predicated surveillance in a criminal investigation as spying. And what Barr was doing there was quite deliberate, it seemed to me. It seems reasonable to infer. He was echoing longtime Republican talking points, including those of his boss, President Trump, because he notably declined to distance himself from those really inflammatory comments that the president had made just moments before Barr sat down to testify, where on the South Lawn of the White House, Trump called the investigation a witch hunt. He said the FBI people were guilty of treason. He said it was illegal. Barr, given a chance to distance himself from that, did not. What he did say, though, is that he is conducting a review of the origins of the Russia and Special Counsel Robert Mueller investigation. And look, it's one thing to raise questions about whether all the rules were followed, but he went beyond that. He compared what happened to the Vietnam-era spying abuses by the FBI. That was surveillance of civil rights groups without warrants. That created the system of FISA warrants that we have today that were used in this investigation of the Trump campaign. And Barr seemed to be suggesting that there's something inappropriate happened. He even referred to a failure at the upper echelon of the FBI. So he's laid a lot on the table here. We have an Inspector General review of some of this that is going to be coming in the coming weeks. That's an independent review, separate from Barr. But Barr's going to do his own review, he is saying, appoint some people at the Justice Department to take a look at it. And it's hard to really know exactly what's going on here, other than that many Republicans were very pleased to hear him say that.
I want to be extra careful because every word matters here, and that we don't paraphrase. So I think we have a little bit more of that exchange of Attorney General Bill Barr specifically talking about spying. Do we have that?
So you're not suggesting, though, that spying occurred?
I don't, I guess you could, I think spying did occur. Yes, I think spying did occur. Congress is usually very concerned about intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies staying in their proper lane. This is not launching an investigation of the FBI. Frankly, to the extent there were any issues at the FBI, I do not view it as a problem that's endemic to the FBI. I think there was probably a failure among a group of leaders there at the upper echelon.
Okay, I suspect Democrats are screaming, saying, how about you stay in your lane? Liz, Bill Barr, put politics aside, is an esteemed, or at least a very well-trained lawyer. He chooses his words carefully. What's your take on him talking spying?
Look, he's a Republican hatchet man. Let's go back to when he was advising about the pardons in the Iran-Contra situation. So he talked about this in his confirmation hearing. The fact of the matter is, we have an attorney general who put himself politically right in the middle of what a special prosecutor, a special counsel, Bob Mueller, did, and he drew conclusions that Mueller failed to. He hasn't released that report yet. There's another report that's coming out about whether there was improper surveillance or activity by the FBI in connection with the campaign in 2016. The only reason I can think that Barr is doing this is he is a flunky for Donald Trump. He's not an independent thinker. He sounds good. He seems sincere. But if you look at what he does, not what he says, then you see the actions of a hatchet man here, and it's really disturbing. Jeffrey Toobin said in the New Yorker yesterday, the fix is in. That's what we see.
Ken, to Liz's point, there is a report. Bill Barr said he's going to investigate the FBI's behavior during the campaign and that we'd see those results at some point. Why? He said that yesterday. Why not wait for that before he has done what he has appeared to have done and drawn a conclusion about what that's going to be, that there is a failure among a group of leaders in the upper echelon of the FBI?
That's a very good question, Ali. You're right. There's an Inspector General report that he said yesterday is due in a couple of weeks. It's going to reach some conclusions about how the Russia investigation got started and whether people followed the rules. But Barr is doing his own review, and while he say he's not asserting that there was any wrongdoing, he did use the phrase failure at the upper echelons of the FBI. So he was making a judgment there. We'll have to see what evidence he has. There are a couple of issues here. One is the FISA warrant to surveil Carter Page, who was with the Trump campaign and then later left. And another is the conduct of an FBI informant named Stefan Halper, who was reaching out to different people, including George Papadopoulos. It may well be that not every I was dotted and T was crossed, but that's a far cry from saying there was spying going on and comparing it to the Vietnam-era FBI abuses, guys.
Liz?
Yeah, he used a loaded word. He's drawn a conclusion. He's decided that spying took place. Spying is not a neutral word. Doesn't mean there was surveillance. He's not saying, gee, I have to find out exactly
But we don't
something went
use
wrong.
that term, right? For law enforcement generally and conducting law enforcement
not.
activities, we don't call it spying.
No, you only use that when you're making a derogatory description of what happened. And he's already judge, jury, prosecutor here.
Yeah.
He's not an independent attorney general. He's being a hatchet man, and that's really, really disturbing. The inspector general is nonpartisan. It's a non-political job. He is inserting himself, the attorney general, in a political way into a decision that he should leave to the inspector general. If that raises questions, sure, go forward and have an independent review. But when you have a president who's been screaming from the get-go, this is a fake investigation. He's tried to stymie it in various ways. And basically following that play rule, that's terrible. And it's scary about what this country's going. The Attorney General should be someone who obeys the law and is not carrying out just a political mandate here.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.